The airport was packed with travelers, strangers brushing past strangers without a second glance. The kind of chaos where anything could happen and nobody would notice. Amara Brooks stood near her gate in scrubs and a gray cardigan, clutching her hospital orientation folder, headed to her very first week as a nurse at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the state. Across the terminal stood a decorated Navy commander in full dress whites. Nobody could have predicted what would happen next, because in one quiet, almost invisible moment, a hand gesture from a rookie nurse would catch that commander's attention and set off a chain of events that would shake a powerful hospital to its core. What none of them knew was exactly who Amara Brooks really was and what she was carrying. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The airport was the kind of loud that gets under your skin. Gate announcements bleeding into each other. Rolling suitcases grinding across tile. A toddler somewhere behind a pillar crying the specific cry that said she had been awake 3 hours past her limit. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International on a Wednesday afternoon was controlled chaos wrapped in fluorescent lighting, and Amara Brooks was standing right in the middle of it, trying not to look like she was about to fall apart. She was 26 years old. She was wearing her dark blue scrubs under a gray cardigan that had seen better days, and she was gripping a manila orientation folder against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the floor. Which, honestly, it kind of was. The folder had Volcrest Medical Center printed across the front in clean navy font, and below it, in smaller letters, New Clinical Staff Orientation, Week 1. Her name was handwritten on the tab in her own careful printing. Amara Brooks, RN, registered nurse. First placement. First real job after 3 brutal years of nursing school, 2 summers of clinical rotations, and 1 exam she had taken twice before she passed it on the second try at 6 in the morning while her roommate slept 2 feet away. She had made it. She just didn't feel like it yet. The flight to Crestwood wasn't for another 40 minutes, and Amara had already read through the orientation packet twice. She knew the hospital's floor layout. She knew the trauma bay procedure manual almost word for word. She had memorized the name of her supervising physician, Dr. Vanessa Pierce, head of trauma, and she had looked her up online enough times to recognize her face in a crowd. She was prepared. She told herself that every few minutes like a quiet internal loop. You're prepared. You've done the work. This is just the next step. She found a seat near gate C, 14, set her carry-on bag beside her feet, and let herself breathe. That was when she noticed the man in the dress uniform. He was hard to miss, honestly. Not because he was loud or demanding attention. Quite the opposite. He was the kind of man who carried stillness with him the way other people carried noise. Tall, built through the shoulders in a way that said functional rather than decorative, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved with some intention. His navy dress whites were immaculate. The ribbons on his chest were stacked in precise rows, and even from 20 feet away, Amara could read enough of them to know she was looking at someone who had been places and done things that wouldn't show up in any civilian conversation. Commander Ethan Cole. She didn't know his name yet, of course. She would learn it later. But right then, he was just the officer near the water fountain, standing with his arms loose at his sides, scanning the terminal with the kind of casual awareness that looked relaxed only if you didn't know what relaxed actually looked like on someone who had never fully turned it off. Amara looked away. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, stared at the screen without actually reading anything. Then she looked back, not at him, at the 2 men who were watching him. They were seated separately, one near the magazine kiosk, one standing by the wall of windows overlooking the tarmac. Different positions. No eye contact with each other. That was the first thing she clocked, the deliberate distance between them. Most people traveling together gravitated toward each other without thinking. These 2 were actively maintaining space, which meant the space was intentional, which meant they were working together without wanting to look like it. They were dressed like everyone else. Jeans, jackets, unremarkable shoes. One had a carry-on bag slung over his shoulder with the strap adjusted too tight, the kind of adjustment you made when you needed the bag to stay close. The other had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he hadn't moved them in 4 minutes. Amara knew because she'd been watching not meaning to, but her eyes kept pulling back to them the way your tongue keeps finding a sore tooth. They were also whispering, not to each other, into their collar. A sleeve, some kind of mic setup that they weren't quite hiding well enough for someone who had grown up watching her older brother run drills in the backyard and explain, with the patience of a much older person, exactly what surveillance looked like from the outside. Malik, she thought, you always said I'd use this someday. Her brother's voice came back to her the way it always did. Steady, low, careful. Amara, watch the hands first, then the eyes, then the feet. People lie with their faces. Their bodies always tell the truth. He'd been 23 when he said that. She'd been 17. He was already a Navy corpsman by then, home on leave, eating their mother's chicken and rice, and talking to her like she was a colleague instead of a kid sister. Sergeant Malik Brooks, Navy corpsman embedded with special operations units. The man who had taught her, over years and over distances, every hand signal, every field communication code, every quiet warning system used by medics working alongside teams who couldn't afford to make noise when things went wrong. He had made her practice the signals until they were reflex. She had not thought of them in 2 years. She thought of one now. It wasn't dramatic. That was the whole point. It was never supposed to be dramatic. She shifted her orientation folder to her left hand, raised her right hand to her cheek like she was resting her face, elbow propped on the armrest. And with 2 fingers, she made a small, precise gesture. A directional point angled downward and to the left, held for 2 seconds, then released. The variation Malik had taught her specifically, the one used by embedded field medics to signal potential threat proximity to special operations personnel. Not a general warning, a specific one. The kind that said, you have eyes on you, right flank unknown intent. Only certain people would recognize it. Only certain people would know what version that was and what it meant. She didn't look at the commander when she did it. She looked at her phone. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she saw it in her peripheral vision. The commander's weight shifted, barely, a fraction, the kind of micro-adjustment that looked like he was just resettling, and his eyes moved. Not to her. He didn't look at her. His gaze swept the terminal in a slow, practiced arc, hitting the magazine kiosk, the window wall, the 2 men, and then moving on without stopping. His posture changed. That was all. Just a subtle reset in his shoulders, a slight dropping of his chin, a recalibration that probably looked like nothing to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But Amara had watched Malik do it 100 times in training videos, in stories, in the careful way he described what it felt like to switch modes in a crowded space. Commander Cole had heard her. Within 2 minutes, and she was still watching, still pretending not to, 2 people in civilian clothes repositioned through the crowd. Not running, not urgent, just moving with the quiet efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. The man at the magazine kiosk drifted left. The man at the window wall simply wasn't there anymore when Amara looked back. They dissolved into the crowd without a ripple. No shouting, no commotion, no announcement over the intercom. The terminal kept moving around her like nothing had happened, because to everyone else, nothing had. Amara sat very still for a moment. Her heartbeat was louder than it should have been. She didn't approach the commander. She didn't try to catch his eye. She gathered her bag, stood, and walked toward the gate agent's desk to ask about the boarding group assignments, because she needed something normal to do with her hands. She was boarding through the jetway when she felt it. A gaze, specific and deliberate. She turned her head once, just slightly, and across the width of the terminal, Commander Cole was looking directly at her. Not a lingering look, not question, just a single, measured nod, the kind that said received and understood and noted all at once, wrapped in 2 seconds of eye contact before he turned away and disappeared toward the first-class lounge. She stepped onto the plane and didn't breathe properly until after takeoff. The flight was 90 minutes. She spent the first 30 of them staring at the clouds outside the oval window, her orientation folder open on the tray table, but unread. Malik had been dead for 2 years. He had died during a classified extraction operation overseas, in a location she still didn't know and probably never would. The official notification had come to their mother's door in a white envelope with a government seal, and the letter inside had used words like fell in service and distinguished conduct and our deepest condolences. It had told him almost nothing. What she knew from the months before. From phone calls where his voice sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. From the last video call where he'd looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Amara, you remember everything I taught you, right? Don't ever forget those signals. Promise me." She'd laughed it off at the time, said something about how she wasn't going to war. He didn't laugh back. 3 weeks later, he was gone. She pressed her fingers against the cool plastic of the window frame and let herself miss him for exactly 5 minutes. Then she picked up the orientation folder and got back to work, because that was what Malik would have told her to do. In first class, Commander Ethan Cole sat with a glass of water untouched on the tray table and his phone in his hand. He had typed a message to a number saved only as a contact letter. Find out who the nurse in row 18 is. Scrubs, gray cardigan, manila folder. She used an embedded field medic signal, the exact variation. Malik Brooks' variation. I need to know who she is and how she knows it. He read it back. Hit send. Then he stared at the back of the seat in front of him and tried to figure out when the last time was that he'd felt a cold shock move through him like that. The kind that happened when something impossible walked up and introduced itself. He had served alongside Sergeant Malik Brooks for 18 months. He had held that man's hand when he died in the field, on a stretcher 3 kilometers from extraction. And whatever the official report said, Ethan knew the full shape of what had happened, even the parts that had been quietly smoothed over in the version that made it to the families. The signal was Malik's. Ethan had never seen anyone else use that specific variation. The angle, the 2-finger directional, the whole duration. It was too precise to be coincidence. Too correct to be imitation. He closed his eyes for a moment. Who are you? He thought. Valcrest Medical Center was exactly as impressive as the brochure made it look, which was its own kind of statement. The main building rose 6 stories above a landscaped courtyard, all clean glass and pale stone, the kind of architecture that said excellence and resources in the same breath. The trauma wing was in the east building, connected by a covered skybridge that was always a little too cold regardless of the season. The lobby had a donor wall, polished bronze plaques arranged in neat rows, and the names on those plaques were the kind that showed up on building dedications and charitable galas and the backs of academic journals. Valcrest was not a community hospital. It was a statement. Amara arrived on a Sunday evening and found her employee badge, a parking pass she wouldn't need because she didn't have a car yet, and a room assignment in the staff residential building 3 blocks over. She spent the night organizing her clinical supplies in order of likely need and reading the trauma protocol binder until her eyes blurred. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, and she was the first one in the orientation room. Dr. Vanessa Pierce walked in at exactly 8 o'clock and looked at Amara the way doctors sometimes look at new nurses. Not unkind, but not warm either. Pierce was somewhere in her mid-40s, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of composed expression that suggested she had spent years training her face not to broadcast what she was thinking. She was brilliant. Amara had read her published work, 3 papers on blunt force trauma protocols, and she ran the trauma department with a precision that some people found cold and others found clarifying. "Brooks," Pierce said, checking her clipboard. "You came from Emory's nursing program." "Yes, ma'am. Your clinical rotation scores were high. Your pharmacology scores were not." "I retook the module," Amara said. "Passed it at 91. Pierce looked at her steadily for a moment. "Good. Trauma doesn't tolerate medication errors. We'll start you on observation shifts. You won't touch a patient independently until I say so." Understood. It wasn't hostility. Amara knew the difference between hostility and caution. Pierce was being careful with her in the way that people are careful with things they haven't evaluated yet. She could work with caution. The orientation group was 7 nurses total, and they spent the morning doing what orientation groups always did: touring floors, reviewing emergency protocols, sitting through compliance modules on laptops in a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers. By afternoon, they were walking the East Wing when an announcement came over the PA system. Commander Ethan Cole, United States Navy, would be visiting the facility on Wednesday, as part of the preliminary assessment for the Volcrest Military Rehabilitation Partnership. The announcement was routine. Several of her orientation colleagues murmured appreciatively about the partnership. It was significant, a contract that would bring veteran rehabilitation services to Volcrest's newly constructed neurorecovery wing, along with funding and national visibility. Two people pulled out their phones to look up the commander's profile. Amara kept her eyes on the floor map in her hands. The same commander from the airport. Of course it was. She didn't know what she had expected, that the signal would dissolve into nothing, that it would be a strange story she'd tell someday. It was connected. She could feel the connection the way you feel a knot in a thread before you've found where it is. She said nothing. In the hospital's executive corridor on the fourth floor, CEO Richard Halden was standing at the head of a conference table, and the 8 people seated around him were doing the particular kind of listening that people do when they understand that a bad outcome will roll downhill and land on them. Halden was in his early 60s, silver-haired and sharp-featured, the kind of man who had spent decades learning to look reasonable even when he wasn't. He had built Volcrest's national reputation over 20 years, and he protected it the way people protect things they've built with their own hands. He was connected, politically, corporately, in ways that extended well past the hospital's board and into rooms Amara wouldn't have known to imagine. The partnership announcement must close on schedule, he said, without raising his voice. Wednesday's visit is not a tour. It's a final assessment. The commander will be evaluating the neurorecovery wing specifically, and every department head in this building will be available, prepared, and presenting a unified picture. Are we clear? Nods around the table. Good. He looked at his notes for a moment, then at Dr. Pierce. Your department will likely see the most scrutiny. The military's medical team will want access to our veteran patient transition records. Pierce nodded. I'll have everything ready. Make sure you do. Halden closed the meeting. As the room cleared, he stayed behind, and when the last person was gone, he opened his laptop to a folder he had not shown anyone in a very long time. It had arrived in his inbox 2 hours earlier. An alert from the hospital's contracted security consulting firm. Routine flag. Airport surveillance footage involving staff travel credentials matching new employee documentation. He watched the clip once. He watched it again. The nurse in the gray cardigan. The 2-finger directional. The commander's micro-response. His jaw tightened so slowly it was almost imperceptible. Impossible, he said, and his voice was barely above a breath. He opened a second file. This one he had to access through a separate encrypted directory, one that was not connected to the hospital's standard server. A file that had sat there for 2 years without being opened. The label on the digital folder read, Brooks M. Incident Review sealed. His hands, setting the laptop on the table, were not entirely steady. He closed the laptop, picked up his phone, dialed an extension. Give me the new nurse's rotation schedule, he said. Brooks, move her to trauma rotation immediately. Full assignments. A pause. And monitor her. He hung up and sat alone in the empty conference room for a long time. Tuesday passed without incident on the surface, which meant the problems were happening underneath it. Amara noticed on her second shift that her patient charting from the previous evening had not been where she filed it. She found it eventually, misfiled in a different patient's folder in the third bay cabinet. The kind of error that could have been a simple clerical mistake and could also have been exactly what it looked like. She refiled everything and made copies. She didn't mention it to anyone. A medication order she submitted for a patient in Bay 4 came back with a dosage discrepancy that didn't match what she had written. The charge nurse handled it, attributed it to a transcription error, and Amara got the same quiet, measured look from Pierce that said the supervisor was aware of every mistake happening in her department. Amara went back to her notes. Her original order was correct. The error was not hers. She copied that too. Wednesday morning came in clean and cold. The neurorecovery wing had been polished to within an inch of its life. The donor wall in the main lobby was freshly dusted. Administrative staff moved through the corridors with the specific energy of people who had been told to look professional and actually meant it this time. Commander Cole's military liaison had sent an advance team the previous afternoon. and 2 uniformed personnel were stationed near the east entrance by 8 a.m. Amara was in the trauma bay at 9 when she heard the voices in the corridor. She had her back to the door, running a supply check. When the group came through, hospital administrators, a couple of military liaisons, Dr. Pierce, and Halden himself, escorting the commander through the wing. She heard them enter, heard Halden's measured, practiced tone going through the partnership talking points, kept her eyes on the supply cart. "The trauma team has been exceptional this cycle," Pierce was saying. "We've expanded our post-surgical monitoring protocols significantly in the last 18 months. I'd be interested in seeing your triage documentation process," the commander's voice said. And Amara went still because she knew that voice now. She knew it from the calm certainty it carried even in an ordinary sentence. She turned slowly, because turning quickly would have been strange, and found herself looking at Commander Ethan Cole, standing 15 feet away in the trauma bay doorway, in a different uniform than the airport, but with the same precise, unhurried quality in his eyes. He saw her in the same moment. She looked up. They both held completely still for exactly 1 beat too long. Pierce noticed. Halden noticed. Then both of them looked away, because whatever had just moved through the air between the nurse at the supply cart and the decorated Navy commander in the doorway was too specific to be acknowledged out loud in a room full of people with agendas. The group moved on. Amara went back to the supply check. 20 minutes later, the tour looped back through the wing as they headed toward the administrative corridor, and Commander Cole stepped slightly to the side of the group, barely a foot, barely a shift, but enough, and said quietly, low enough that it didn't carry, "You trained under Brooks." Her hand stopped moving on the clipboard. She turned to face him and kept her voice the same register. "He was my brother." Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition clicking into place. His eyes were steady on hers, and she could see him recalibrating something internal. "Malik Brooks." "Yes." "How do you know him?" "I served with him." His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something careful and heavy. "For 18 months. He was part of my unit." Amara's mouth opened slightly and closed again. The orientation folder she was holding felt suddenly very heavy in her hands. She stopped. Started again. "He never mentioned anyone from the unit by name. They weren't supposed to." "No, they weren't." Cole's eyes moved briefly toward the corridor where the group was pausing by the nurse's station, Halden explaining something, then back to her. "Your brother was the best medic I ever served with. I need you to know that." "I know that," she said. Her voice stayed even, but her chest had done something complicated and painful. "The official report," he said, and now his voice was very deliberate, each word placed carefully, wasn't complete. The corridor clock above them ticked twice. "I've been saying that for 2 years, Amara said. He held her gaze for a moment. Nodded once. Then he stepped back in a line with the group, and the tour moved on, and Amara stood alone at the supply cart in the trauma bay, her clipboard forgotten in her hands, her heart loud in her ears. For hours later, the ambulances started arriving. Multi-vehicle accident on the interstate connector, 3 cars, a delivery truck, secondary rear collision involving 2 more vehicles. The trauma bay received 7 patients in 42 minutes, which was the kind of sustained load that separated people who understood emergency medicine from people who thought they did. Amara moved. It was the only way to describe it. She moved the way she had been trained to move, and more than that, the way she had spent 2 years of clinical rotations learning to move without thinking, with her hands already going toward the right place before her conscious mind had finished processing the instruction. Vitals assessment on the incoming. Airway first, always first. The ABC priorities she had drilled until they were automatic. She had been told she was on observation. She tried to observe for approximately 90 seconds before the charge nurse in Bay 3 looked at the chaos and said, "Brooks, secondary Bay, go." And that was the end of observation. She worked 2 patients simultaneously through a portable partition, maintained clean lines of communication with the attending physician, caught a medication allergy in intake paperwork that the admissions clerk had missed, and spent 11 minutes managing a hypovolemic patient's fluid balance while waiting for the trauma surgeon to finish in Bay 1. She was good. She knew she was good. Not in an arrogant way, in a way that you know when you've worked for something long enough and hard enough that it's become part of how you're built. Commander Cole had stayed for the afternoon briefing in the administrative wing and was crossing the sky bridge when the trauma bay alarm started and staff began moving with urgency. His military liaison tried to redirect him toward the parking level. He didn't redirect. He found a clear line of sight through the bay windows and stood there for a while, watching. He watched the young nurse in scrubs move through controlled chaos with a calm that looked, from the outside, like she'd been doing this for 10 years. He thought about Malik, about 18 months in the field, about the medic who could hold a unit together under fire and make it look like breath. Of course, he thought. Of course she's like this. Pierce found him there, watching. She stood beside him for a moment without speaking. Then, carefully, "That's a first-week nurse." "I know," he said. Pierce glanced at him once and then back at the bay. Her expression was unreadable. She had her own questions forming. Amara could feel them later, in the way Pierce watched her during debrief with something sharper than evaluation. Something that was starting to look like concern. After the patients were stabilized and the bay was resetting, Pierce pulled Halden into a corridor exchange that Amara didn't hear, but Pierce's body language described clearly. Why is a first-week rookie suddenly running secondary bay? Halden's answer was short. His face was neutral. Pierce didn't look satisfied. The day ended. Amara sat in the staff break room with coffee she didn't taste, writing up her shift notes in careful, thorough detail. She was tired in the specific way that felt earned. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at the screen. Your brother dug too deep. Some things should stay buried. She stared at it for a long moment. Typed nothing back. Screenshotted it. Save the number. She thought about Malik. About the way his voice had sounded on that last call. About don't ever forget those signals, Amara, promise me. She thought about Commander Cole's voice in the trauma bay. The official report wasn't complete. She was still thinking about it when Cole found her in the corridor outside the break room at the end of his own extended day, his jacket over his arm and the military liaison waiting 10 feet behind him with the patience of someone paid to wait. He stopped in front of her, looked at her steadily. Your brother, he said quietly. He didn't die the way they told you. The corridor hummed with the low, ambient noise of a hospital at shift change, busy and indifferent. Amara looked at him for a long time. Tell me everything, she said. The words hung between them in the corridor like smoke. He didn't die the way they told you. Amara had spent 2 years living with a version of her brother's death that never fully fit. The letter with the government seal. The folded flag at the memorial. The carefully worded condolences from people who looked at the floor when they delivered them. She had pressed twice through official channels and been given the same polished non-answer both times. Classified operation, limited disclosure, we understand this is difficult. She had eventually stopped pressing, not because she believed them, but because she didn't know what else to do with a door that wouldn't open. Commander Cole was standing in the hospital corridor at the end of a long shift, and he was telling her the door had always been unlocked from the inside. They found a family consultation room that was empty, small, private, a round table and 4 chairs and a box of tissues on the windowsill that neither of them touched. Cole sat across from her with his jacket folded across the back of the chair, and he told her what he knew. Not all of it. He was careful about that, careful about which parts were still classified and which parts were simply true, but enough. Malik, he said, had been on standard in-bed rotation with Cole's unit for about 4 months when he started noticing something off about the medical supply chain coming through their forward operating base. Equipment arriving in batches that didn't match the documented manifests. Sedative compounds logged under generic supply codes. Neurological monitoring hardware that had no standard military medical application. He brought it to me the first time, Cole said, his elbows on the table, hands loosely clasped. I told him to document it quietly and keep his head down until we could escalate it through the right channels. That was the wrong advice. He said it plainly, without softening it. I've been living with that for 2 years. Amara was very still in her chair. He kept investigating. He did. And he was good at it, careful, methodical. He cross-referenced supply logs against patient outcome reports. He found sedation irregularities in post-combat neuro cases. Soldiers who had been treated through a private contractor's medical unit were coming back with symptoms their official records didn't account for. Cole paused. The contractor running those operations was a company called Helix Strategic Medical. The name landed quietly. Amara repeated it to herself, just internally, once. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out the orientation packet she still carried out of habit and turned to the third page, the hospital overview, the major partnerships and donors list that she had read twice on the plane and 3 times since. She sat on the table and pressed her finger against a line near the bottom. Helix Strategic Medical, listed as one of Volcrest's largest private donors, with a partnership notation attached to the new veteran neurorecovery wing. Cole looked at it. His jaw tightened. He found a connection, Amara said. It wasn't a question. He was starting to. Before he died, Cole looked up from the paper to her face. The extraction where he was killed. The official classification was hostile enemy contact. That's what the report says. What the report doesn't say is that Helix personnel were operating within range of that extraction zone, and that Malik had encrypted files he was moving through back channels in the 48 hours before he died. Amara's throat tightened. She thought about his voice on that last call. Don't forget the signals. Promise me. He hadn't been afraid of the enemy. He had been afraid of what he knew. Someone knew he was moving those files, she said. Yes, Cole said. Someone did. The family consultation room felt very small suddenly. 2 floors up, Richard Halden was not sleeping. He stood at the window of his corner office with the city lights spread out below him and his phone on the desk behind him, and he was doing the mental arithmetic that he had been running since the airport security footage landed in his inbox. The numbers kept coming out wrong. The nurse's name matched the file. The signal matched the medic. The medic matched Malik Brooks. And Malik Brooks was a name that was supposed to be 2 years buried in a classified folder in a family's grief. He picked up his phone and called Julian Mercer. Mercer picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake too. We have a problem, Halden said. A pause on the other end. Smooth, unhurried. Define the problem. The nurse I mentioned. She made contact with Cole today, in the trauma wing. They spoke privately. Another pause, longer this time. Is it the brother? Her name is Amara Brooks, Malik Brooks' younger sister. She's a first-week nurse in my trauma department, and she just spent 20 minutes alone with the man who commanded her brother's unit. The silence on Mercer's end was the kind that meant he was thinking rather than waiting. That's unfortunate timing, he finally said. It's worse than that. She used the signal. The airport footage shows it clearly, the exact variation. Cole recognized it. Then she knows something, or she will shortly. Halden turned away from the window. Cole told her the official report was incomplete. I don't know how much further he's gone. Then contain it, Mercer said. His voice was still smooth, still even, and that was the part that had always made Halden uncomfortable, the complete absence of alarm in a man who should have had some. You know what's at stake. Halden ended the call without answering. He stood alone in his office and looked at the donor wall image on his desk. A framed photograph from 3 years ago, the groundbreaking ceremony for the neurorecovery wing. He was in it. Mercer was in it. A Helix executive was in it, smiling at the camera with the comfortable smile of a man who expected everything to go his way. He sat down, opened his laptop, pulled up Amara's employment file, and underneath it, through the secondary directory, Malik's sealed incident review. He read it for the first time in 18 months. His hands were not steady when he closed it. The next morning, Amara arrived at her shift to find a note in her employee inbox. Her rotation had been updated, effective immediately, to include the new veteran neurorecovery wing as part of her weekly case exposure. Staff orientation, tour, and observation, signed off by Halden's administrative assistant. She read it twice. Then she tucked it into her bag beside the growing collection of screenshots and copied documents she was quietly assembling, and she went to do her job. Dr. Pierce was already in the trauma bay when Amara arrived, running through archive supply contract files on her office computer with a focus that didn't look like routine administration. Pierce looked up when Amara knocked on the open door, assessed her for a brief moment, then looked back at her screen. Brooks, you're on the Neuro Wing tour this afternoon. I saw the update. Pierce hesitated, just slightly, a fraction of a pause that a less attentive person would have missed. Be thorough. Take notes on the equipment. It was a strange thing to say to a nurse on a standard orientation tour. Amara noted it. She noted also, over the next several hours, that peers kept returning to a specific folder of archived records. Military trial medications cross-referenced against trauma supply logs from 5 and 6 years prior. Amara didn't ask. She watched, and she waited, and she filed the information away. The warning text came at 11:40. She was in the break room, eating a sandwich she wasn't tasting when her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, different from the previous one, but the same dead, anonymous quality. She picked it up. Drop the questions. This is the only warning you'll get. She took the screenshot, added it to the folder, ate the rest of her sandwich. That afternoon, she walked the neurorecovery wing. It was Volcrest's crown jewel, the showpiece they trotted out for press visits and donor events. High ceilings, natural light through floor-to-ceiling windows, rehabilitation equipment arranged with the care of a medical catalog photo shoot. The nursing staff here moved differently than in the trauma bay, quieter, more deliberate, the pace of long-term care rather than acute crisis. The patients in the wing were veterans in various stages of neurological rehabilitation, and the technology supporting their care was the most advanced the hospital had. The tour guide, a young administrator named Davis, walked her through the wing with practiced enthusiasm, pausing at each major installation to explain its function. Amara listened and took notes and asked the kind of questions that sounded like orientation curiosity. She was at the far end of the wing when she saw it. A wall-mounted neurological monitoring unit in Bay 6. Clean white casing, a specific display interface, a model number she had seen before in a completely different context. Her steps slowed. Malik had sent her a photograph once. One of the few he was allowed to send, carefully cropped and with no identifying background. He'd circled something in the image with a red marker. Recognize this? It doesn't belong here. She had not known what it was at the time. She had not understood the significance. She understood it now. The unit in the photograph and the unit in Bay 6 were the same model. Same casing. Same interface. Same Helix logo in the lower right corner. Davis was still talking somewhere behind her. She pulled out her phone under the pretense of checking her notes and took a photograph of the unit's model number. She took 3 from different angles. That evening, Amara was in the supply corridor near the administrative wing when she heard Halden's voice through the partially closed door of a conference room. She would have kept walking. She had no reason to stop, except that she heard her name. The Brooks girl is asking too many questions. She stopped, pressed her back against the wall beside the door, breathing slow and even. She hasn't asked anything directly. That was a different voice, one of the administrative directors, she thought. She's on the neuro tour. That's where you put her. I put her there to manage the variable, not to let her wander. A pause. Your brother made dangerous assumptions, and they cost him. She froze. He was talking about Malik. Directly, specifically, with the casual certainty of a man who had known the full shape of what happened and had always known. Not I'm sorry for your loss. Not the careful distance of someone who had only read a file. The familiarity of someone who had been part of it. She walked away from the door before her body could make a decision she wasn't ready for. She walked at a normal pace. She found the stairwell, went down 2 floors, and sat on the bottom step with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat on her knees. Your brother made dangerous assumptions. He didn't just know about Malik's death. He knew about Malik's investigation. He knew what Malik had found and where he'd been looking and what it had cost him. That wasn't something you knew from a classified government letter. That was something you knew from being on the inside of what happened. She pulled out her phone and texted Cole. We need to talk. Tonight. I know Halden was involved. His reply came back in under 2 minutes. I know. I just got the notice. Hospital CEO has formally requested a delay to the military partnership timeline. Official reason, administrative review. Real reason, he's buying time. Amara read it twice. She thought about that. A CEO stalling a lucrative military contract that he had spent months building toward. A deal that would benefit his hospital financially and reputationally. A deal that required Commander Cole's sign-off. Why would Halden deliberately delay a deal he needed? Unless closing the deal meant Cole would be embedded at Volcrest long enough to start asking the same questions Malik had asked. The three of them met that night in a corner booth of a coffee shop 4 blocks from the hospital. The kind of place that stayed open late and didn't ask questions, with bad lighting and good noise cover from the counter speakers. Dr. Vanessa Pierce arrived 2 minutes after Cole and Amara sat down without preamble and set a folder on the table between them. "I've been pulling archived records for 6 weeks," she said, before anyone else could speak. "I wasn't looking for this specifically. I was auditing our surgical supply contracts as part of a departmental review, but the same name kept coming up." She opened the folder to a stack of printed pages. Helix Strategic Medical, cross-referenced against archived post-combat neurological implant trial data. Trial patients. Several of them were later transferred to Volcrest for continued care. Cole leaned forward. Transferred when? The earliest was about 4 years ago. The most recent was 14 months back. Pierce's composure was intact, but the set of her jaw said the composure was doing real work. "I found records of experimental neurological implants tested under military medical cover overseas. Not standard issue devices. Prototype hardware, early-stage trials, inadequate safety documentation." She looked at Cole directly. "These were your people. Show me the trial dates." She did. He looked at them for a long time. "These overlap with Malik's deployment rotation," Amara said quietly. "By about 8 months, yes," Pierce confirmed. Cole sat back. He found the trial data. That's what he was moving through back channels, not just supply irregularities. He had the trial documentation. The pieces had been separated across 3 different people and 3 different corners of the same story. Sitting in this coffee shop 11 at night, they were finally in the same place at the same time. The next morning started badly and got worse. The hospital's IT department sent a system-wide alert at 7 a.m. A routine server maintenance cycle had resulted in the loss of several digital patient files in the Neuro Wing's records archive. The alert was phrased to sound like a technical inconvenience. Amara read it at the nurse's station and felt the cold certainty of it settle into her stomach. Routine maintenance didn't delete entire patient files. It didn't target one specific wing. It didn't happen the morning after the 3 of them had sat in a coffee shop and compared notes on what those files contained. She went to the Neuro Wing before rounds. The nursing staff there were doing their morning handoff, calm and professional, and the patients in the rehabilitation bays were beginning their day the way they did every day, carefully, incrementally, with the particular determination of people fighting their way back from something that had taken a significant piece of them. One of those patients was in Base 7. His name was Thomas Greer, former Navy SEAL, mid-40s, heavy set through the shoulders, even now, with a quiet watchfulness that survival had built into him. He had been transferred to Volcrest 8 months ago, following neurological complications from his combat service. In his chart, the portion of it that still existed after the night's server event, listed him as stable, responsive, ongoing monitoring. He had been part of Malik's last mission. Amara knew this because Cole had told her the previous night before Pierce arrived. One of 3 surviving members of the extraction team. The other 2 had been discharged and relocated. Greer was still here, in this wing, under Helix-manufactured monitoring equipment, and he had not yet been cleared for release. She was reading his chart at the nursing station when the monitoring alarm in Bay 7 sounded. Not a soft alert, a full cardiac alarm, the kind that moves people. She was through the bay door before the alarm finished its first cycle, gloved and reaching for the crash cart rail by instinct. Greer was seizing. A full tonic-clonic episode, severe, his body pulled rigid against the bed rails, his face a color she did not like. The floor nurse was already there, calling the code, and the attending physician was 40 seconds behind. Amara worked the airway. She didn't ask permission, and nobody stopped her. She worked the positioning, the suction, the oxygen delivery, talking through what she was doing in the clear, flat narration that chaotic situations needed. Suction ready, airway clear, lateral position, monitoring vitals, and by the time the physician arrived, the immediate danger had been stabilized and the seizure was cycling down. The physician took over. Amara stepped back. She stood against the wall of Bay 7 while the team worked, and she looked at the neurological monitoring unit mounted on the wall above Greer's bed. The same Helix model she had photographed the day before. Its display was running a continuous readout, and she was not a neurological technician, but she had been reading everything she could find about these devices for the past 48 hours, and the calibration settings displayed on the screen were not within the standard range documented in the device's published specifications. They were outside it, by enough to matter. She photographed the screen. Then she photographed it again. 2 hours later, Pierce pulled Amara into a supply room that was temporarily empty and said, without greeting, "The seizure wasn't idiopathic." "I know," Amara said. "The implant readout I pulled from this morning. The calibration settings are overridden. Someone manually changed the output parameters on that device." Pierce's voice was precise and controlled, but underneath, it was something very close to fury. "This isn't a malfunction. This is an intentional deviation from safe operating range. Who has the authorization to make changes to those settings remotely?" Pierce looked at her steadily. "Executive-level credentials. The system logs executive access as a single administrative override code." Amara already knew what she was going to find. She could feel it the way you feel the last line of a sentence before you read it. "Can you pull the authorization log?" Pierce opened her tablet and turned it toward her. The authorization entry was time-stamped 6 days prior. The credential code resolved to a single name. Halden. Amara looked at it for a long moment. Her reflection looked back at her in the tablet's dark border. Scrubs, cardigan, a face that had been doing a great deal of work in the past 72 hours to stay calm. He signed off on a calibration override for an implant device in a patient who is currently experiencing unexplained seizures, she said. "Yes," Pierce said. "A patient who was on Malik's last mission." Pierce didn't answer that. She didn't need to. Cole was in the hospital that afternoon for a follow-up with the military liaison team. And when Amara found him in the corridor near the administrative wing, she didn't bother with preamble. She pulled up the tablet photograph and showed him the authorization log. He looked at it the way people look at things that confirm what they already feared. Quietly. Completely. "Halden signed off on the override," she said. Cole's jaw set. "How long ago?" 6 days. "Before Greer's seizure this morning by almost a week." He handed her back the tablet. He was very still in the way that people who are accustomed to managing extreme anger in extreme conditions are still. Not calm, contained. "If those devices harmed my men," he said, and his voice was low and completely even, "I will burn this hospital to the ground." The words were not hyperbole. She believed him. "We need proof that will hold," she said. "We need more than the log. We need the original trial data, the financial connections, and something that ties Mercer to Helix directly. The log proves Halden touched the device. It doesn't prove where the order came from." "Mercer," Cole said. "I overheard a conversation in his office. Halden isn't running this. He's managing it. There's a difference." Cole absorbed this. Not at once. Halden, meanwhile, was having a different kind of afternoon. He met Julian Mercer in the private dining room on the 4th floor that was technically reserved for board functions and was, in practice, used for conversations that needed walls. Mercer arrived unhurried, in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and sat down with the ease of a man who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. "It's resurfacing," Halden said. He did not sit. He stood at the window with his hands in his pockets, and his voice was tight in a way he couldn't entirely control. "The nurse has the authorization log. Cole has seen it. Pierce is pulling archived trial records." Mercer cut his food with precise, unhurried movements. "Then contain it. I'm trying to tell you that containment is no longer straightforward. We buried it once," Mercer said. Not loudly. Not with any particular emphasis. Just evenly. The way you say something you've said before and expect to say again. The methodology hasn't changed." Halden turned from the window. He looked at Mercer, really looked at him, and he saw, not for the first time, the thing underneath the smooth surface. The thing that had been underneath it for years, that he'd spent years finding reasons to look past. "Mercer, there's a Navy commander involved now. There are military officials asking questions. This isn't There's a first-week nurse and a soldier with a grudge, Mercer said, finally looking up. And a doctor who's about to discover how quickly careers can change direction. Handle it. He went back to his food. The hospital announced the following day that the Volcrest Military Rehabilitation Partnership Gala would be held in 3 weeks. A televised event, black tie, investors and military brass and media all in one room for the formal contract announcement. Commander Cole would be the keynote speaker. Halden made the announcement at the all-staff briefing. His voice was steady. His hands, behind the podium, were not. Amara was in the back of the briefing room. She watched Halden deliver the announcement and thought about the sealed file in his encrypted directory and the authorization log, and the words he had spoken through a partially open door. The brother made dangerous assumptions. She thought about Greer in Base 7, stabilized now, but fragile, with a Helix device in his head that someone had deliberately miscalibrated 6 days before he seized. She took the stairs down to the parking garage after the briefing because the elevators were slow and she needed to move. She was 2 rows from her entry door when she heard footsteps behind her, too close, too deliberate, not the random footfall of someone heading to their car. She turned. The man was large, in a security uniform that she recognized as a contractor badge rather than hospital staff ID. He stopped when she turned, which meant he had been following her specifically. "You're working a lot of late nights, nurse." His voice was easy and flat at the same time. "Long hours. It'd be a shame if something happened to make the commute harder." Before Amara could respond, she heard the sharp sound of her car, parked 3 spots behind her, and registered the faint smell of brake fluid that hadn't been there this morning. The man was already walking away. She stood in the parking garage for a long moment, breathing carefully. Then she called Cole. "Don't drive your car," he said, before she finished explaining. "I know that. Are you hurt?" "No. Good." A pause. "Amara, we're running out of time to do this quietly." She looked at her car, at the concrete floor beneath it, at the dark corner of the garage where the man had disappeared. "Then we stopped doing it quietly," she said. She walked back into the hospital. In the neuro wing, Greer's monitoring system emitted a sharp alarm at 10:40 that evening as the IT department ran a second round of server maintenance. The implant telemetry data in his patient file began auto-erasing, line by line, systematically, the kind of deletion that didn't happen by accident and didn't stop without intervention. Ethan Cole, who had stayed late in the hospital at Amara's insistence, was in the neuro wing when it started. Amara was right behind him. She looked at the screen, looked at the deletion counter ticking upward, and she did the thing Malik had taught her. Not a signal this time, but a principle. When you can't stop the threat, isolate the patient from the threat. She reached behind the monitoring unit and disconnected it from the hospital network manually. The deletion stopped. The partial data logs that remained were fragmentary, incomplete, but they existed. Cole stood at her shoulder, looking at the screen, and the expression on his face was the one she was learning to read, the one that meant the rage was fully present and fully controlled and pointed at something specific. "That's enough," he said. He wasn't talking about the data logs. "We go to the gala," Amara said. "All of it." In front of everyone. The neuro wing didn't quiet down until well past midnight. Greer had been restabilized, vitals holding, seizure activity suppressed, the attending neurologist hovering over his chart with the focused unease of someone who couldn't fully explain what they were looking at. The Helix monitoring unit sat disconnected from the hospital network, its screen dim, its data logs frozen mid-deletion at whatever percentage had been preserved when Amara pulled the cable. The floor nurses moved with the careful efficiency of people who knew something significant had happened and weren't yet sure what to say about it. Cole stood at the foot of Greer's bed for a long moment after the medical team cleared. He looked at the man in the bed, the stillness of him, the monitors, the equipment, and his face held the particular expression of someone accounting for a debt. "He was on the ground with Malik," Cole said quietly, not to anyone specifically, just out loud, because some things need to be said into a room. "I know," Amara said. She was at the monitoring unit with her phone, documenting every visible data point on the frozen screen before anyone thought to remove it. Calibration settings, timestamp logs, the partial telemetry that hadn't erased in time. She photographed it methodically, frame by frame, the way her brother had taught her to document evidence in the field. Thorough, sequential, nothing skipped because it looked minor. Pierce arrived at 10 past midnight in a coat pulled over her off-duty clothes, which meant she had come from home, which meant someone had called her. She looked at the monitoring unit, looked at the screen, looked at Amara, still photographing it. "Tell me you save enough," Pierce said. "Enough to compare," Amara said. "Maybe enough to prove." Pierce sat down at the nursing station terminal and pulled up the archived Helix trial reports she had been quietly compiling for the past week. She set them beside the partial implant logs Amara had preserved and began cross-referencing with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. "Cole, watch your work. What are you looking for?" "A match." Pierce didn't look up. If the malfunction pattern in these logs matches a defect Helix documented internally and then suppressed, meaning they knew about it, buried it, and kept shipping the devices, then this isn't negligence. She paused. It's knowing and deliberate. The room was quiet except for the low beep of Greer's heart monitor and the soft clicking of Pierce's keyboard. 15 minutes later, she sat back in her chair. "It matches," she said. "The calibration deviation in Greer's unit is consistent with a known output defect Helix identified in their internal testing and removed from their safety disclosure documents before filing for military medical approval." She said it evenly, like she was reading a clinical finding. They knew the devices could trigger neurological events under specific conditions. They'd buried the data, and someone in this hospital, using executive credentials, manually pushed a patient's device into exactly those conditions. Cole stood very still. Amara looked at the photographs on her phone. At Greer. At the wall. "We have to move," she said. Cole had already been moving in the background, in ways the hospital wasn't aware of. He had been careful about it. Quiet communications through his military contacts, unofficial channels, the kind of network that operated below the level of formal requests and paper trails. He had not told his command everything. He had told them enough. Enough for the right people to start paying attention to the right corners. By the following morning, Volcrest's administration received a formal inquiry from a military medical oversight office regarding the Neurorecovery Wing's device procurement documentation. The inquiry was framed as a routine audit request. It was not routine. Halden received it at 8 a.m. and called his legal team before he called anyone else. By 9 a.m., he had issued 3 internal directives, a media silence protocol across all departments, a restricted access order for the Neuro Wing, and a mandate for an immediate internal investigation to be conducted exclusively by hospital-appointed personnel, not independent reviewers. Hospital-appointed. Amara read the directives on the all-staff bulletin and felt the shape of what they were. Not transparency. Containment. The instinct of a man trying to get his hands around something before anyone else could reach it. She was walking the East Corridor at 10 when she heard Julian Mercer's voice. She hadn't seen him in person since the hospital boardroom briefing 2 weeks earlier. She knew who he was by face and reputation, the way you know people who occupy the upper levels of an institution without ever directly interacting with them. He was in the corridor near the administrative wing with 2 people she didn't recognize, and he was speaking in a low, measured register of a man delivering instructions rather than having a conversation. She caught fragments. Career incentives. A name she recognized as one of the senior nurses in the Neuro Wing. Cooperation isn't optional. She kept walking. Didn't slow. Didn't look. But she pulled out her phone and sent Pierce a text. "Mercer is working the staff. Directly. Be careful." Pierce replied 30 seconds later. Already heard. 2 residents were approached this morning. Offered research grant nominations in exchange for discretion regarding ongoing administrative matters. Mercer was efficient, Amara thought. She had to give him that. While Halden was running damage control through directives and legal teams, Mercer was working the human infrastructure, the people who held information, who had access, who could either talk or be quietly motivated not to. He understood that institutions were made of people, and people could be managed. The parking structure was the place she least wanted to be. She had parked 3 blocks away since the break incident, walking the extra distance every shift without complaint. But the hospital's east entrance was under HVAC maintenance that afternoon, and the detour ran her through the garage level, and she was halfway through when the footsteps came from behind a concrete pillar to her right. Different man than before. Same contractor badge, same flat effect, same carefully calibrated proximity that said this is a warning, not an action. He stepped into her path without touching her, and she stopped, and they stood 3 feet apart under the fluorescent hum of a parking structure at 2 in the afternoon. Your brother thought he was untouchable too, the man said. Amara looked at him. She was aware of her heartbeat, aware of the distance to the stairwell door, aware of the security camera above and to her left whose angle would catch the pillar, but not both of them, depending on exact positioning. She had noted all of this in the first 2 seconds. She had also noted that he said thought. He was a Navy corpsman embedded with special operations, she said. Her voice was level. He wasn't untouchable. He was just right. And being right was enough to scare the people who needed him quiet. The man said nothing. You can keep sending people to parking garages, she said. It won't change what we already have. She walked past him. Her hands were shaking by the time she hit the stairwell. She pressed them flat against the wall for 10 seconds, breathing deliberately, the way Malik had taught her to breathe after a field stress event. 4 counts in, hold. 4 counts out. Don't let the body's alarm system run past the moment that triggered it. You feel it. You acknowledge it. Then you keep moving. She kept moving. That evening, Cole sat across from her in the same coffee shop as before, and she told him about the parking garage, about the man, about what he'd said. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his coffee and said, Your brother called me the night before the extraction. I didn't know it was the last time. He paused. He told me that whoever had tipped Helix off, it wasn't someone overseas. It was someone stateside, someone who knew his full name, his unit, his investigation timeline. A leak from inside, from somewhere close to the top of the domestic operations structure. He looked at his hands briefly. I've been trying to find the source for 2 years. I think it leads to Mercer. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then she told him what she hadn't told anyone yet. Not Pierce, not in any text or document. The thing she had been carrying since the night of his first disclosure, the thing that had been sitting at the center of everything since she understood what Malik had actually known. His last call to me, she said, he didn't sound like himself. Not frightened exactly. More like someone who had already made all their decisions and was just waiting for the consequences. She looked at the table. He said, someone back home already knows. Be careful who you tell. I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. Cole's expression was very quiet. He knew the leak was domestic, Amara said. He tried to warn me even then. He was protecting me. She didn't cry. She had done her crying in private, in the specific isolated moments she allowed herself, and she had made her peace with the grief by turning it into something directional. But her voice, for just a moment, had the weight of 2 years in it. Cole nodded once, slowly. Then we finished what he started. She nodded back. The anonymous tip to the journalist had been sent by Pierce. Carefully worded, strategically timed, enough to create external pressure without revealing the full scope of what they had. The journalist's name was Dana Whitfield, and she covered military healthcare corruption for a national outlet with enough editorial independence to run a story that would make institutional lawyers uncomfortable. She had published 3 pieces in 2 years that had triggered federal investigations. She was exactly who you wanted on the other side of an anonymous tip if you were trying to force something into the open. Pierce confirmed the tip had been received and acknowledged. By the end of the week, there were 2 journalists making calls to the hospital's communications office. Halden's communications director sent Pierce a terse email about managing external inquiries through appropriate channels. Pierce forwarded it to Amara without comment. That same afternoon, Pierce decrypted the final segment of Malik's archived message. She had been working on it for 3 days. The encryption was a variation of a field metacommunication code, and she had needed Amara to walk her through the signal logic before the last layer resolved. They sat together at Pierce's office terminal, and when the final text rendered on the screen, they both read it at the same time. Volcrest isn't the victim. It's the pipeline. Amara read it twice. The room felt very still. Malik's words stayed with Amara through the rest of the day and into the next morning. Volcrest isn't the victim. It's the pipeline, not a hospital caught up in something larger. not an institution that had been used without its knowledge. The pipeline, the domestic endpoint, the place where overseas experimental trial data came home, where Helix's prototype devices found their way into living patients under the cover of legitimate veteran rehabilitation care. The place where the money flowed in and the silence was maintained and the whole structure had somewhere to land. She sat with Cole and Pierce in Pierce's office with the door closed and the blinds adjusted, and Cole walked them through the architecture of it the way you walk someone through a map they've been standing inside without knowing the scale. The overseas trials had been the beginning. Helix had embedded its experimental neurological devices into military medical operations under contract. Standard enough on the surface, the kind of arrangement that happened through procurement channels and wasn't scrutinized heavily because military medical contracting operated in a space between oversight categories. But the devices weren't ready. The internal safety data showed that clearly. Helix had suppressed the defect documentation, pushed through approvals, and continued deploying hardware they knew was unstable. When symptoms began appearing in patients, the kind of neurological irregularities that didn't fit standard combat injury profiles, Helix needed somewhere to send those patients. Somewhere they could continue monitoring the long-term outcomes of their trial without it being called a trial. Somewhere with the clinical infrastructure to manage complex neurological cases and the institutional discretion to keep those cases quiet. Volcrest, Pierce said. Volcrest, Cole confirmed. The Veteran Rehabilitation Partnership wasn't a new idea. It was the formalization of something that had already been operating informally for years. Pierce's expression was controlled, but her eyes said something else. She had built her career in this hospital. She had published research from this hospital. She had believed it was what it presented itself as a center of excellence, a place that took serious care seriously. The realization that the institution had been functioning as a laundering system for compromised trial outcomes was landing in layers, the way large betrayals do. Mercer built this, Amara said. It wasn't a question. Mercer is the connection point, Cole said. Halden runs the hospital, but Mercer runs Halden. He pulled up a document on his phone. Pierce's financial records, the shell company analysis she had been quietly building. Follow the money from Helix. It routes through a series of donor vehicles before it reaches Volcrest's operating accounts. Those donor vehicles are all connected to a private foundation, the Mercer Family Health Initiative. Pierce had found it. She had found it 3 days ago, late at night, sitting alone in her office with financial documents that a hospital medical director had no particular reason to be pulling, which meant that pulling them was a choice she had made consciously with full awareness of what it meant for her career. Money laundering, Pierce said. Structurally, yes. Helix funds moving through Mercer's foundation before arriving at Volcrest as charitable donations. It sanitizes the financial relationship between a medical device contractor under unofficial scrutiny and the hospital receiving their trial patients. Cole set the phone down, and it gives Mercer direct influence over Volcrest's board decisions, because Mercer's foundation is one of the hospital's largest funding sources. He controls Halden because Halden's hospital depends on the money. Amara thought about the boardroom, about Halden's voice on the phone, tight and careful, and Mercer's voice through the door. You think you run this? You manage it. The hierarchy had been there in plain language. She just hadn't had the full context yet. A retired corpsman called Cole that afternoon. He wouldn't give his name. He spoke carefully in the way of someone who had thought about this call for a long time before making it. He confirmed that Malik had not been working alone in the final weeks. There had been a small, informal network of medical personnel who had noticed the same supply irregularities and had been quietly compiling parallel documentation. Most of them had been transferred, reassigned, or separated from service before they could act on it. One had been officially discredited through a manufactured conduct complaint, and someone had leaked the network's existence to Helix before Malik could move the files. He said there was a domestic contact, the corpsman told Cole. Someone with clearance-level access to personnel information who was feeding Helix the names of anyone asking the wrong questions. He paused. Your man Brooks figured out who it was, I think, in the last week. He just didn't have time to document it. Cole ended the call and sat with the information for a moment. Mercer had access to military contracting networks through his board positions. He had served on 2 federal healthcare advisory committees. He had clearance-adjacent relationships with procurement oversight offices. He had, in effect, been positioned precisely where someone would need to be positioned to monitor and intercept exactly the kind of internal investigation Malik had been running. Malik had gotten close. Close enough that Mercer had moved to neutralize him. Amara needed to hear it directly. Cole told her. She had thought she was ready for it. She had been building toward it for weeks, connecting the lines, understanding the shape of the thing. But hearing it said plainly, Mercer identified your brother as a threat and acted on it, was different from knowing it abstractly. It moved through her like cold water, and she sat with it for a full minute without speaking. She didn't collapse into it. That was not who she was and not what Malik had raised her to do. She let it be real, let it sit in her chest with the full weight of what it was. And then she said, "How do we prove it?" "The financial trail is part of it," Cole said. Pierce's records, combined with the shell company documentation, established the Mercer-Helix financial relationship. The implant logs and trial data established the device cover-up. Malik's archived message establishes Volcrest as the pipeline. He looked at her. But the direct link, the evidence that Mercer specifically identified Malik and acted to silence him, that's what we're still missing. Malik's last video message, Amara said. She had been thinking about it since the airport, since the signal, since the moment she understood why her brother had made her promise to remember it. Not just the gesture, but the specific variation, the precise angle and duration, the version that only embedded medics with his specific clearance level would have used. She had assumed it was a warning system. She had been right about that. But it was more than a warning system. It was an encryption key. Malik had been careful. He had built redundancy into everything. Supply log backups, parallel documentation networks, encrypted message chains. He would have known that data could be wiped from servers. He would have known that files could be sealed and access could be revoked. He would have found a storage method that didn't live on any server, that couldn't be remote deleted, that would survive everything except losing the key. The key he had made her memorize as a teenager. The key he had made her promise never to forget. She applied the signal's directional encoding sequence as a decryption input, something she had worked out in the weeks since Cole first told her about the encrypted files, sitting alone in her staff room, testing variations until something resolved. A secondary file, layer unlocked. The video was 14 minutes long. Malik was sitting in a forward operating base. She could tell from the background the specific quality of the light, and he was looking directly at the camera with the calm of someone who had decided to be calm because calm was the only useful thing left. He laid out everything. The supply irregularities, the sedation records, the neurological devices, the trial documentation, the suppressed safety data. And then, in the last 4 minutes, he named Mercer directly, board member, Mercer Family Health Initiative, Helix Procurement Pipeline, and stated clearly that he believed Mercer had been feeding personnel information to Helix through a protected advisory channel. He had dates. He had transaction references. He had enough. Amara watched it with her hands flat on her desk and her breathing controlled, and when it ended, she sat very still for a moment. Then she called Cole. "I have it," she said. The gala was in 6 days. Pierce had already copied every relevant file to 3 separate encrypted drives. The implant logs, the trial records, the financial documentation, Malik's archive message. She had moved the copies to locations outside the hospital's network on 3 consecutive evenings, varying her route each time. She had stopped using her hospital email for anything related to the investigation. She had, in the space of 2 weeks, become someone she had not previously been. Not just a physician, but a person who understood that institutions could be machinery for concealment, and that working inside them sometimes meant working against them. Cole was coordinating with his military contacts to ensure that the right people, the right level of brass, the right oversight officials would be at the gala. Not officially investigating, just present, available, ready to receive what was coming. They were 3 days from the event when the hospital's server system was hit overnight. Not a routine maintenance cycle this time. A sophisticated intrusion, targeted, moving through the Neuro Wing's records architecture and the administrative document storage simultaneously. Someone was making a final attempt to clear the field before the gala. Cole's IT contact in the military liaison team had installed a passive monitoring program on the hospital network 4 days prior, under the guise of standard military partnership technical review. It detected the intrusion. It didn't stop it, but it logged the access point, the deletion targets, and the credential signature of the account used to initiate it. The credential signature resolved to a proxy account. The proxy account traced back through 2 layers to a system access node registered under Mercer's foundation. They barely saved the files. The backup drives Pierce had moved off-site held everything the hospital's servers had lost. 3 days before the gala, Mercer called a closed board session. Amara didn't know the specific content of what was said, but she watched Halden walk out of the administrative corridor afterward looking like a man who had been told precisely how much trouble he was in and precisely what would happen if he didn't manage it. He walked past her in the hallway without seeing her, or without wanting to see her, and his hands at his sides were the hands of a man doing very deliberate work to appear composed. That evening, Pierce sat in her office reading back through the complete documentation package they had assembled. She looked up when Amara knocked. "Are you ready for this?" Pierce asked. Amara thought about the airport, about the signal, about Malik's voice in a video she had watched 100 times without understanding it, about a man in dress whites across a crowded terminal who had recognized something that was supposed to be forgotten. "He spent his whole career doing the right thing in places no one was watching," she said. "The least I can do is do it once in a room full of people." Pierce looked at her for a moment, nodded. Mercer, in his penthouse office across the city, ended a phone call and sat at his desk in the particular stillness of a man who had managed crises before and expected to manage this one. His expression was composed. His eyes were calculating. "Then it's time," he said quietly, to no one, "to remind them how accidents happen." He closed his laptop. The gala was in 3 days. The ballroom at the Crestwood Grand was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel like whatever happened inside it mattered. 12-foot ceilings, chandeliers casting warm gold light across round tables draped in white linen, a raised stage at the far end with a podium and the Volcrest Medical Center seal projected on a screen behind it. Military dress uniforms alongside tailored suits, alongside the particular brand of business casual that journalists wore when they wanted to look like they belonged somewhere expensive. Servers moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility. The bar was open. The conversation was smooth. On the surface, it looked like every other institutional gala, controlled, expensive, self-congratulatory. The kind of event where money and reputation shook hands in public, and everyone pretended it was about something larger than both. Beneath the surface, every person Amara trusted was in position. She stood near the east entrance in a navy dress she had bought 2 days ago specifically for this, her evidence drives in a small clutch bag that she had not let out of arm's reach since Pierce handed them to her that afternoon. Cole was near the stage, in full dress uniform, scheduled to speak within the hour. Pierce was at a table near the center of the room with her laptop bag over her chair and a direct connection established to the ballroom's AV system. She had spent 40 minutes that afternoon with the venue's technical coordinator under the pretense of preparing the partnership presentation slides. Dana Whitfield was at a table near the back, press credential clipped to her jacket, a recorder in her pocket, and her phone on the table with 2 editors on standby, waiting for a message that would tell them to hold the front page. Amara had met her briefly in a hotel lobby the previous morning. 10 minutes, a handshake, a transfer of duplicate files. Whitfield had looked at the documentation for 3 minutes and then looked at Amara with the expression of someone who had spent a career waiting for exactly this kind of story to walk through the door. When it breaks, Whitfield had said, it will break fast. Make sure you're ready for what comes after. Amara had thought about that. She was as ready as she was going to be. Halden arrived at the gala, looking like a man held together by the specific tension of someone who had not slept in 3 days and was performing composure for an audience that could not know it was a performance. His color was poor. His smile, when he deployed it for donors and board members, didn't reach anything above his mouth. He moved through the room with the careful tread of someone navigating a surface they weren't sure would hold their weight. He saw Amara near the east entrance and looked away immediately. She watched him do it. Mercer arrived 20 minutes later, and the difference between the two men in the same room was the difference between someone carrying weight and someone who had learned to distribute it invisibly. Mercer was polished, easy, working the room with the fluid confidence of a man who had spent decades ensuring that rooms worked in his favor. He shook hands, smiled with his eyes, asked questions that made people feel noticed. He was very good at what he was. He passed within 8 feet of Amara without acknowledging her existence. The formal program began at 8. Halden spoke first. The welcome, the institutional overview, the carefully constructed narrative of Volcrest as a leader in veteran medical care. He read from his notes more than usual. His voice held. 2 board members spoke. A military liaison gave a brief address about the partnership's significance. Then Commander Ethan Cole walked to the podium. The room settled into the particular attentiveness that decorated military officers commanded in formal settings. Cole had presence, not performed presence, the kind that came from doing things in conditions where presence was either real or you didn't come back. He stood at the podium and looked out at the room for a moment before he spoke. He began with the standard language. The partnership, the commitment to veteran care, the hospital's rehabilitation infrastructure. He spoke well, precisely, and the room listened with the satisfied attention of an audience hearing what it expected to hear. Then his tone shifted. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about Cole. Nothing he did was performed. The shift was simply that he stopped reading from the script and started speaking from somewhere else. I want to talk about the men and women this partnership is supposed to serve, he said. His voice was the same register, but something in it had changed. I want to talk about what it means when the institutions designed to protect them fail them instead. Not through incompetence, not through negligence, through deliberate choice. The room's attention sharpened. Some of our wounded veterans were not healed in this facility, Cole said. They were experimented on. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a large room full of people choosing not to react until they understood what was happening. Halden's face at the head table had gone the color of old concrete. The devices used in this hospital's veteran neurorecovery wing, Cole continued, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the room without effort, were prototype hardware manufactured by a private contractor called Helix Strategic Medical. Helix conducted unauthorized neurological trials on active-duty military personnel overseas. They suppressed internal safety data, documenting a critical device defect. They then arranged for trial patients, your veterans, our people, to be transferred to this hospital for continued monitoring under the guise of standard rehabilitation care. The room broke open at that. Not chaos, a controlled fracturing, the sound of 100 conversations starting simultaneously, chairs shifting, phones appearing in hands. Mercer was already moving. He stood from his table with the smooth, unhurried authority of a man who had managed public rooms before and moved toward the front with his hands slightly raised, the body language of someone preparing to redirect. I have to interrupt, he said, projecting over the noise with practiced ease. What the commander is describing is a serious allegation being made without evidentiary basis at a public event. This is not. Dr. Pierce, Cole said. Pierce, at her center table, opened her laptop. The gala's main screen behind the podium changed. The partnership presentation disappeared and was replaced by a series of documents. Clean, readable, and large for the room. The implant calibration logs. The Helix internal trial safety data with the suppression notation highlighted. The financial transfer records showing Helix funds routing through the Mercer Family Health Initiative before arriving at Volcrest's operating accounts. Side by side. Sequential. Undeniable. Gasps moved through the room in a wave. Mercer looked at the screen. His expression, for just a fraction of a second, broke from its composure, a flash of something cold and calculated before the mask reassembled. He turned back to the room. These documents are fabricated, he said, with complete authority. This is a coordinated attack on a legitimate medical institution by individuals with personal grievances. I have national security clearance documentation that covers the medical operations being mischaracterized here, and I will have every person involved in this facing. I have one more piece, Amara said. The room found her. She was standing near the edge of the stage, and she had not planned to speak from the front. She had planned to let the documents do the work. But Mercer was good, and she could feel the room beginning to waver toward his confidence. The way rooms sometimes wavered toward the person who sounded most certain, and she was not going to let that happen. She walked to the podium. Cole stepped aside. She set her clutch bag on the podium surface and looked out at the room. The military brass, the investors, the journalists, the hospital staff, the donors hauled in at the head table. Mercer 3 feet from the stage, and she thought about a video call from a man sitting in a forward operating base with the calm of someone who had already made all his decisions. "My name is Amara Brooks," she said. "I'm a trauma nurse at Volcrest Medical Center. My brother was Sergeant Malik Brooks, United States Navy corpsman, embedded with special operations units overseas. He discovered this conspiracy and was silenced before he could expose it." She kept her voice even. "Before he died, he hid his evidence. He hid it in a signal he taught me when I was 17 years old. A signal I used in an airport 3 weeks ago without fully understanding why, until I did." She connected her phone to the AV system through the adapter Pierce had set up. He encoded his final evidence file as a video message. "The signal he taught me was the encryption key. What you're about to see is what my brother died trying to make public." She played it. 14 minutes of Malik Brooks sitting in a forward operating base, speaking directly and calmly into a camera, laying out everything he had found. Supply irregularities, sedation records, device trial documentation, the helix suppression data, and then, in the last 4 minutes, naming Julian Mercer, board member, Mercer Family Health Initiative, Helix Pipeline Domestic Contact, with dates, transaction references, and the specific advisory channel through which personnel information had been leaked to identify and neutralize everyone who had been asking the wrong questions, including himself. The room was completely silent for the entire 14 minutes. When it ended, nobody moved for a moment. Then Halden stood up. He didn't say anything for a second. He just stood there at the head table with his hands pressed flat on the white linen, and his face doing something complicated and human that his performance of composure had not been able to fully suppress. He looked at Mercer. Then he looked at the screen, where Malik's video had just ended. "I tried to stop it," he said. His voice was not loud, but the room was quiet enough that it carried. "When I understood the full scope, when I realized what the patient transfers actually represented, I tried to pull back. But I was already inside it. The money was already flowing. The files were already sealed." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I made choices I cannot defend. I'm not trying to defend them. I'm telling you that the man in that video was telling the truth, and that Julian Mercer is the reason he is not alive to say it himself." Mercer turned to look at Halden with an expression that was perfectly still. "You have nothing," Mercer said, quietly enough that only the front of the room heard it clearly. "He has us," Cole said. The ballroom's main doors opened. 4 federal investigators in civilian clothes entered from the east entrance. 2 more came in from the service corridor on the west side. They moved without urgency, with the practiced calm of people executing a plan that had been in place since before the event began. Cole's military contacts had made calls, and those calls had reached the right offices, and the right offices had spent 3 days reviewing the documentation Pierce had delivered through secure channels. Mercer assessed the room, assessed the exits, made the calculation that people like him made in moments like this, the calculation of whether there was still a move available. Then he turned toward the service corridor. Cole stepped directly into his path. They stood face to face for a moment, Mercer in his tailored suit and Cole in his dress uniform, and the room held its breath. "Your brother died, believing truth wins," Mercer said to Amara, not looking away from Cole. His voice was low and even and contained something that might have been admiration if it hadn't been so cold. "Let's see if you do." The federal investigators reached him. He was escorted out of the ballroom with the quiet efficiency of an arrest that had been prepared for, and the doors closed behind him, and the room stayed still for another moment before it broke into the particular controlled chaos of a large space full of people who had just witnessed something they would be describing for the rest of their lives. Dana Whitfield was already typing. The story broke at 11:17 that night. Whitfield's piece went live with the headline, "Veteran Patients Used as Trial Subjects in Military Contractor Cover-Up, Hospital Board Member Charged." By midnight, it had been picked up by 4 national outlets. By 6 the following morning, it was the lead story on every major news network, and the name Helix Strategic Medical was attached to the kind of coverage that corporate legal teams spend careers trying to prevent. The investigation that followed was not a single event, but a sustained unraveling, the kind that took months, moved through multiple jurisdictions, and pulled threads that kept revealing more threads underneath. Military hearings convened within 2 weeks. The oversight committee that examined Helix's military medical contracting history found documentation of unauthorized trials stretching back further than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Device procurement records were subpoenaed. The advisory channel through which personnel information had been leaked, the mechanism Mercer had used to identify and silence investigators, including Malik, was traced, documented, and formally entered into the congressional record. Helix Strategic Medical ceased operations pending investigation. Its executive leadership faced federal charges across 3 counts: fraud, unauthorized human trials, and obstruction of a military investigation. The charges were specific and documented, and the kind that didn't dissolve quietly through legal maneuvering. Mercer faced the most serious charges of all. The financial records Pierce had compiled, the shell company trail, the foundation money flows, the Helix procurement pipeline, combined with Malik's video evidence and the leaked personnel records, established a case that his legal team spent considerable effort trying to minimize and failed. The trial took 7 months. The verdict was not in his favor. He was sentenced to federal prison on multiple counts, including conspiracy, financial fraud, and obstruction, resulting in the death of a military whistleblower. Amara sat in the courthouse hallway when the verdict came in. She didn't go inside for the reading. She hadn't been able to make herself sit in the same room as the proceedings for more than a few hours at a time, and she had stopped apologizing for that. Cole texted her from inside, guilty on all counts. She read it twice and sat with it for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, in the specific stillness of someone letting something real finally land. Halden cooperated with the investigation from the beginning. His testimony was extensive and, by the account of the federal team, unusually candid. Not the calculated cooperation of someone minimizing liability, but the account of a man who had spent years making compromises that compounded past the point of exit and had decided that a complete accounting was the only thing left available to him. He lost his position at Volcrest immediately. He lost his medical administrative license 6 months later. He did not face prison. His cooperation, and the evidence that he had made internal attempts to slow the patient transfer program before being fully overridden by Mercer's board influence, factored into the prosecution's calculus. He would carry what he had done. That was what he had left. Dr. Vanessa Pierce became Volcrest's interim medical director. The appointment was not without debate. There were board members who wanted an external candidate, who felt that internal leadership represented continuity with a compromised institution. Pierce addressed the board directly and said that she had no interest in continuity with what the institution had been and significant interest in building what it should become. She proposed a restructuring plan that included an independent ethics oversight committee, transparent vendor contracting protocols, and a dedicated veteran patient advocacy function that reported outside the standard administrative hierarchy. The board approved it. The Neurorecovery Wing was suspended pending full device review. Every Helix manufactured unit was removed and replaced through a vetted alternative procurement process that Pierce oversaw personally. Thomas Greer, who had seized in Bay 7 and survived and spent the following months in careful, monitored recovery, was one of the first patients to complete rehabilitation under the restructured program. He was discharged on a Thursday morning, walked out of the east entrance under his own power, and shook Cole's hand in the parking lot with the grip of a man who had been through something and come out the other side of it knowing exactly what it had cost. Cole had visited Greer twice a week through his recovery. He hadn't made it a significant thing. He just showed up. The military formally honored Sergeant Malik Brooks 4 months after the verdict. The ceremony was held at the naval station in Norfolk, and it was not a small affair. The posthumous recognition was attached to a broader military hearing on whistleblower protection and medical contracting, and the people in the room were the kind who would carry the policy implications of what they heard back to offices with actual authority. Malik received a posthumous commendation for distinguished service and meritorious conduct in an investigation of unauthorized military medical operations, language that was careful and formal and true. Amara delivered the remarks. She had written and rewritten them a dozen times, and the version she finally read was the shortest, for minutes, no notes from memory. She talked about her brother the way you talk about someone when you have finally moved past the grief of losing them and into something steadier. Not forgetting, not healed exactly, but arrived. She talked about what he had known and what it had cost him and what he had believed about the relationship between truth and consequence. She talked about the signal he had taught her in their mother's backyard when she was 17 and how she had spent years not knowing what she was carrying. He hid his evidence in something he gave me long before he knew he would need to, she said, because he trusted me with it before either of us understood what it was. That's who he was. He prepared for the worst while hoping for better, and he made sure the people he loved were equipped to carry what he couldn't finish. She paused. I carried it. I finished it. That's the only eulogy he would have wanted. Cole was in the front row. He did not look away from her once while she spoke. When the formal portion ended and the room broke into the quieter, more human movement of people talking in small groups and finding each other after shared experience, Cole came and stood beside her. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. What happens to you now? He asked. Pierce offered me a leadership role in veteran trauma care, Amara said, coordinating the new patient advocacy function with a restructured neuro wing. You're taking it? Yes. She thought for a moment. There's also a scholarship fund. They're naming it after Malik, for nursing students from military families. I'm on the selection committee. Cole nodded. He looked out at the room. He would have found that completely excessive and been quietly proud about it. She laughed. A real one, sudden, the kind that came from being understood. Yes, exactly. He was a good man, Cole said. The best I served with. I know, she said. They stood together for a moment in the way of people who had been through something real and come out of it with a specific mutual trust that only that kind of passage builds. Not friends exactly in the ordinary sense, not the easy warmth of shared preference or proximity. Something more particular, the bond of two people who had stood in the same difficult place and chosen the same direction. The scholarship fund received its first donations 3 weeks later. By the end of the year, it had enough to support 4 nursing students annually through their clinical training. The inaugural class was announced at a small ceremony at Volcrest, restructured, still healing, but standing, and Amara spoke briefly at that too. She was getting better at speaking. She thought Malik would have teased her about it. 6 months after the gala, Amara Brooks was in an airport. Different terminal than the first time. Different city. She was traveling to a veteran trauma care conference in San Diego, and she had a window seat and a journal article she was presenting and a conference tote bag that was already heavier than she had intended. She was standing at her gate, checking her boarding pass, when she noticed a young man across the terminal. He was 22, maybe 23, military bearing, just barely civilian clothes, the specific self-containment of someone who had learned to take up less space than they needed. He was watching the room, too carefully, not afraid exactly, alert in the way that people stayed alert when the context around them had trained them to. She recognized it. She crossed the terminal. He looked up when she stopped a few feet away, measured, assessing, the quick evaluation of someone who had been in enough uncertain situations to check their exits. Sorry to intrude, she said. I just wanted to say, you're doing it right. The awareness. It's a good instinct to keep. He looked at her, uncertain. She made the signal. The 2-finger directional, precise angle, correct duration. Malik's variation. His eyes changed. My brother taught me that, she said. He was a Navy corpsman. He said it was for people who needed to communicate something important without making noise. She smiled. He was right about most things. The young man looked at her for a moment. Then something in the set of his shoulders released slightly. The particular release of someone who has been carrying alertness alone and suddenly understood they didn't have to. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, picked up her conference tote. She walked back to her gate and sat down and looked out the window at the tarmac. The planes lined up in the gray morning light, the ground crews moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who knew their work, and she felt the thing that she had been slowly learning to call peace. Not the absence of loss, not forgetting, just the knowledge that the thing Malik had started was still moving through the world, passed from hand to hand, signal to signal, from the people who carried it to the people who needed it. She picked up her journal article. She had a flight to catch. If Malik could hide the truth in a signal he taught his little sister years before he even knew he'd need to, what has someone you love already placed in your hands that you haven't recognized yet? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next one might just change how you see everything.